alimadat. My name is Shereen Noorali, and I'll be your moderator today for today's Critical Conversations. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of social justice, land acknowledgement, and recognizing the history and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am speaking from the ancestral lands of the Lenape tribes in Manhattan. Our guests, Jena Karim, is speaking from Afghanistan, and Professor Karim H. is speaking from Canada. Each of us are speaking from the territories of various Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treated and some unceded. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous people on these lands, and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we're talking about a very exciting topic, Islam and democracy, a look to the past to prepare for the future. Today, we'll provide an opportunity for us to explore, 1, the current post-elections environment, 2, how democracy, participation, and governance has existed in past Muslim societies, and 3, how we can look into the future with confidence and agency. During the session, you'll also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We'll try to address as many of these questions as we can. With that, it's my honor to introduce you to our wonderful panelists. Jena Karim has worked in democratic governance and civil society development for 18 years in and on Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Iran, Myanmar, Pakistan, Sudan, Tajikistan, and the United States. Her focus has been on constitutional, legal, and electoral reform, civic and voter education, pluralism education, and women's empowerment. She has an LLM in constitutional law, a master in Islamic studies, and a bachelor's in comparative politics. Jena published a monograph on Islam and political polarization in Pakistan and has delivered academic lectures and conference presentations on civil society, governance, pluralism, and legal reform in Afghanistan and Myanmar. She's currently the Deputy Director of the Asia Foundation in Afghanistan. Dr. Karim H. is the director of Carleton University's Center for the Study of Islam and teaches at Carleton's School of Journalism and Communication in Ottawa, Canada. He's also been a director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies and is an award-winning author. His writings have been translated into several languages. Professor Karim has served in the Canadian government and as a consultant to various branches of the US government. He has also been an advisor to the Aga Khan University and the University of Central Asia. Professor Karim has delivered distinguished lectures at venues around the world and has been interviewed by the media in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Iran, and Australia. Thank you both so much for being here. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers and myself expressed during the course of this conversation are each our own. So now let's turn to the conversation. Thank you both for being here. I think one very important place to start is the right now. Joe Biden is the 46th president-elect of the United States. We also just went through a very close election. Some of the projections were not as expected. It was much tighter. I saw some analysis about this idea of the Muslim vote, which represents about less than 1% of the US population, and 65% voted for Biden and 35% voted for Trump. In our own community, we see that there is a lot of political difference in the preference of candidates. And for some people, that has created a lot of surprise that people from the same community would vote differently. There is sometimes the sense of a personal affront when someone votes differently because of the way that we understand and make meaning out of what it is to vote for one politician over another. And so there's been a lot of chaos in this political era that we've lived through. But one thing that I think has come out that has been really beneficial is naming the hurt. And so, as a way to understand how we can heal from this when people in our Jamaat may have different political differences than our own, Jena, I would love to know if you can help us make a little bit more understand this tension and where we can go from it.
Sure. Thank you, Shereen, ITREB, and all who are attending today, and Professor Karim. It's fantastic to be here with you all. I think that point that the margins were so much slimmer than we thought. We thought there were obvious positions to take, and the fact that there weren't, I think, is going to be studied for many, many, many years. This is not a political moment that's over. It's going to sustain for some time. And when we think about our own community, what's interesting is that anytime you do any analysis of how people vote, I think what's been missing, and this is why polling is maybe not always correct, is that it doesn't take into account lived experiences. And how those lived experiences are interpreted is not the same from person to person. How some people interpret economic fragility, how some people interpret the need for tax cuts, how some people interpret the need for healthcare or whatever other issues there are is going to be different. And so they're going to perceive the candidates' positions differently. And so the notions of lived experiences and perceptions of impact, even more so than impact itself. I mean, there's a saying in politics that perception is reality in the political space, because that's what informs choice. And so when we consider now how divided everyone is and how polarized everyone is, we need to take a step back and look at our own ethics and the ethics of our Ismaili tradition, but also the broader sort of Muslim tradition, and come at it from a place of empathy, and to really understand those lived experiences so that we can heal, right? We can't just reach across lines and have it be okay. It has to be a more deliberate process and a more careful process and a more thoughtful process. And that's why I think when Maulana Hazar Imam talks about pluralism so pointedly, it's something that we very much should pay attention to. It's a useful lens because it doesn't assume that unity means that we all vote the same way. Because we're not perceiving things the same way. Our circumstances are not the same. Pluralism allows for those differences. It celebrates those differences, and it allows us to engage with difficult differences, things like this election, for example. And so the starting point for pluralism, even within our own community, even if we think we already embody pluralism, the starting point for all of this is empathy instead of reaction. And it's hard. It's an impossible task because everyone has a very staunch position right now because we're so polarized. And for us to actually get past that, it's for us to, we don't have to change our views, but we certainly need to be empathetic to those who may have different views than us and why those views are the way they are.
Thank you. And it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a perception in a lot of media that one identity marker makes a single voting block, as opposed to this idea of like, why do you vote differently? What are your lived experiences? And Professor Karim, I would love to hear from you how this power of the narrative also translates into the way that we define governance and democracy. And what are other ways that we can look at this so that in another election, maybe there's a different way to say something like not the Muslim vote or not the Latinx vote, but what are better ways of understanding or newer ways of understanding all of this?
Yeah, this is a very complex issue. And this particular election has really brought to the fore issues of identity, as well as issues of governance and how people view what is good governance and what are the appropriate policies that a particular government takes, and how do they affect me if I'm going to vote. How is the position of a particular candidate going to affect me and my family and perhaps my community? And so let's take the term the Muslim vote. So is there such a thing? Because as Jena said, there are issues of identity and how do we parse that? Because we are so many things. We are identified by our community, our religious community, the Ismaili Muslim community, but we also are individually. We have a gender identity, an ethnic identity, a political identity, a professional identity, etc. So there's so many ways in which we think about ourselves and what is important to us. And living in a society which has a particular form of governance. So obviously we're speaking about the United States, and democracy is the way that the country is governed. Democracy, of course, it comes out of the Greek word demos, which is the people. So for the people, of the people, and by the people. Now, what does that really mean? Because the people are many. So to use the phrase "e pluribus unum," from the many, one. So there is a conception that even though there are so many different identities, there is a certain expectation that in a certain sense, the national community, the national population is united. There is an acceptance of political differences. Hence, there are party positions. And what has fascinated me as a Canadian is that there are two major parties. Of course, there are a few small parties which we rarely hear about, if ever. But there are two major parties in a population of over 300 million. And so people find themselves having to identify as either Democrat or Republican. Whereas within those parties, then there's so many pluralities, there is pluralism. There's so many different identities, so many ways of thinking of what is good governance, depending on one's personal values, one's economic interest, one's issues with respect to gender and other social policies, etc. And so we need to understand that there is a lot going on here. And the way that people identify can be multifarious. And so this is, as we have found out through this election and through previous elections, a very, very complex situation. And when we come to our Jamaat, we refer to it as a community. But it has pluralism, as has been pointed out earlier. It is pluralistic. Ethnicity, country of origin, experiences, gender, etc. And so the first thing is obviously to recognize that not everyone thinks the same way, that not everyone's livelihood is the same. We all have different ways of earning our living, of protecting our family. And what do we consider to be our priorities, our contexts? And these considerations will play into the political decisions that we make in terms of who to vote for. And so to sum up, basically, I'm pointing to an understanding, a better appreciation of the many complexities that people face in any society that leads to making a particular decision as to who to vote for.
Yeah. Sometimes it feels like we've sort of simplified the frameworks, the mental frameworks in terms of how to interpret what's going on. And I'm sure part of that is also there's just a lot. It's a lot to process. I think the past has a lot to help us in terms of shedding light on today. And Professor Karim, I would love to hear your thoughts on the concepts of democracy, participation, and governance as it was incorporated in past Muslim societies. How do you see these ideas incorporated in the world today, both at a broader level and also for our Jamaat?
Okay. So I don't want to make this political science 101, but let's just quickly review the origins of democracy. So we know that the concept of democracy emerged in ancient Greece, a couple of thousand years ago, at least, long before Islam. But it was a particular kind of democracy. It was largely the elites, the rich people, the political elites who could even be voted, who had the vote to be represented in the form of governance that they had. Women did not have the vote, and other people had very little political participation. But it was the beginnings of democracy. Now, when we look at the emergence of Islam with Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, I'm not sure if we can sort of categorize for example, the state in Medina over which Prophet Muhammad presided necessarily as a democracy. Certainly not in the Greek model. It was undergirded, it was underwritten by particular values. And that's what's important. When we look at also the succeeding Muslim states, whether it is the Ismaili state of the Fatimid Empire or the Alamut period, or so many other Muslim states, we certainly cannot talk about democracy until very late into the 20th century, or so about the early to the mid 20th century. These were not ideas that originated in Muslim societies. They originated in Greece, in Rome. They were developed later on. Of course, Europe itself was not democratic by any stretch of the imagination until in recent centuries, in the Enlightenment. And so we have to understand that there is a history, that there is a particular trajectory within which Muslims have had a certain path. And to be completely frank, Muslim societies have had a struggle to maintain democracy in their societies. And of course, Jena herself is working in Afghanistan, so she certainly knows, practically the kind of problems and challenges that Muslims are facing. But nevertheless, even though democracy is not something that Muslims invented, it's not in the Quran, it's not in the Hadith, we have embraced it. And let's talk about our position in Western societies, in the United States. The Ismaili community is a minority, as there are so many other minorities of different kinds. And basically, as an American citizen, there is the aspiration to participate in American governance at various levels, starting from the school boards. And I understand that there are certain Ismailis who are involved in school boards, and that's wonderful. All the way up to Safia Wazir's position in the House of Representatives in New Hampshire. It's remarkable. Muslims, Ismailis, have been elected in so many other countries as well. Not too many, but a few. And I'm thankful, that in Canada we have a number of members of parliament and one senator. And we had Ismaili representation in Syria, in Tanzania, and in other places. And so there is a certain history of participation that Ismailis have had in democracies where we are minorities. So the task has been to find our footing in this larger public sphere, which is run, which has elections, which has a certain understanding of governance, of what is good governance. And Ismailis sometimes find themselves in different political parties that compete against each other. And this is perfectly normal. This is how democracy works. And so when within the community, people have different political allegiances and different political leanings, this is perfectly normal. It is not out of the ordinary. And this is how society operates.
Jenna, I know you have a spotty internet connection in Afghanistan, so I saw that you hopped back in. I want to move this more from, so, we talked a little bit about democracy. I want to talk about governance and justice. And what is governance in Islam? A participant made the point in the chat that while the Prophet lived during a time that didn't have democracy in the same way that we understand it, there was a sense of constitutionalism and pluralism. And so how has justice unfolded? Something that is a principle as Ismaili Muslims that we have practiced throughout our history. How have you seen that incorporated in Muslim societies through governance?
Sure. I think what's really important to mention in all of this is that democracy is an evolving entity. It's not an end in itself. It's a work in progress forever, much like pluralism, right? It will never necessarily reach a perfect end. So when we think about justice or even democracy, the basis for all of this, and one thing that we're struggling with here is trying to make the connection between ethics, which is where political philosophy starts. It's where the sort of ancients started with a body of ethics. It's where Muslim thinkers who drew from Plato and Aristotle started. And so ethics is kind of what formed the ideas behind democracy and consensus. And as societies grew, the need for consensus on governance became greater. Just because you couldn't govern everybody individually, or the groups were too large, so you needed to systematize consensus through elections. And so that's kind of a point that we're trying to make here with religious groups, that it's not that these are Western impositions and Western ways of thinking, but that they are actually very, they're very consonant with Islam in terms of their ethics. And frankly, within Abrahamic traditions in particular, there was so much interaction between dynasties. It's hard to even know who started what, just because there was so much influence. Things were translated from Greek into Arabic, into Hebrew. And so you'll see a lot of those differences. And I think in terms of justice, there are bases, right? There are codes of ethics that have evolved into laws, right? Even if you look at Western sort of the justice, it starts with ethics. It starts with a way of behaving and how those behaviors will be regulated. And you come up with a system you come up with rule of law that way. Is that always good? Is that always helpful? No, simply because, again, when you have to govern large societies, people are going to behave differently and they're going to place different values on how to behave. So it is a very confusing and difficult situation when you have such a large society to govern, which is why democracy and governance have to go together, so that the people can decide ultimately how they want. But when you look at treatises on justice, you see sort of foundations of current justice systems and kind of ideas behind rule of law. So things like due process, the right of due process, you'll see that come up in certain Muslim political treatises or human rights treatises on what constitutes rights and whose rights. In Islam, our focus is less on natural rights. Nothing is self-evident. That's a big difference between sort of Western systems and sort of more Judeo-Christian systems than Muslim systems. But that notion of divinity and a leader and authority to decide what is, what is ethical is a very critical difference, and it affects governance, and it does affect rule of law. Where we're at now, though, is how justice is implemented is very different, but the basis is pretty similar, because you'll see things like due process, things like rights of minorities, that pop up fairly early in Islamic thought, like from Al-Farabi into the 12th, into way into the 12th, 13th centuries, way after him. And so it's a fascinating kind of thing to see. Even things like attorney-client privilege. How you treat people who ask you for counsel and how you maintain confidence is also something you'll see pop up in a lot of Muslim treatises on human rights.
The importance of justice. Jena, can you talk more about how the implementation of that in the governance structure and our own very person-to-person human Jamaati structure can support the empowerment of marginalized in society? And I think this would be an appropriate moment to acknowledge that the three of us are not representative of the broader Jamaat in any way, shape, or form. And so what does that look like at a broader governance structure, and how do we bring that value of justice that comes from many different parts of our lived life and the value systems in which we operate to make sure that we are constantly redistributing power and representation, and also advocating for our own?
Absolutely. So in sort of at a more basic level of philosophy, rights of minorities was always a very critical part of Islamic jurisprudence. So when you interpret that now within a Jamaati structure, it's two things, right? Any power comes from voice and representation. And so how are we representing voice within a Jamaati structure is really important. Are people just brought in because of their a singular perspective of their identity, or the basis of their knowledge, or are they given leadership positions? Are they enabled, right? There's a notion of equality versus equity, where are we providing leadership training to those who may not have had it, to marginalized groups who may not have had it, so that they can be considered for leadership positions in the Jamaat. And also, for the institutions which have a high degree of privilege, how are we using that privilege to raise someone else up, whether it's through programming, but also how are we lifting them to be leaders, very consciously, I think is a very important question, because that determines, again, how pluralistic our institutions are, and how equity, which is the basis of justice in Islam, not equality, but equity, where we are meeting people where they are and lifting them based on that. It's a very important kind of consideration. And truthfully, the institutions have made significant strides in that way. It's not just certain people that get tapped. Now you're seeing a broader perspectives. You're seeing people reach out to people they may not have years ago. And so there are positive strides, but certainly more opportunities to grow.
Thank you. Professor Karim, in our prep session, one of the things that you said that really stood out to me was this 2 layers of civil society. And if you don't mind sharing that framework in the context of the Jamaat, I think that would be really beneficial.
Certainly. I've been looking at the Jamaat's institutions for a number of years now. And obviously, the institutions that exist have been, the evolution basically has taken place since the early 20th century, since Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah's time. And what we have now is a certain self-perception of the institutions. And by this, I mean both the council structure and the AKDN structure as a form of civil society. That this is not part of government, but it is outside the government, but nevertheless involved in a quasi-political way, not as the British would say, a capital P, but in a way that assists people to have a good quality of life. And it's basically what Jena speaks to with respect to doing this in an ethical way, in a way that respects our values, and so on. And so it is an interlocutor with government. It enables minorities and other groups of people to participate in public life, in society. And so that is a fairly stable position we are in as far as our institutions go. Now, of course, the Jamaat isn't equal to institutions. The Jamaat is more than the institutions. Everyone is not a participant at a particular time in the institution. Some people will never be members of the institutions in their entire lives. So the people who feel that they can participate in a different way, I'm talking about Ismailis here. And so we have various ways of engaging with society in a social context, in a cultural context, even in a political context. And so those are just as valid as our community institutions. I myself have engaged in organizing conferences. I held a major conference on Ismaili studies. It was not done under the aegis of Ismaili institutions, but certainly the Institute of Ismaili Studies participated, as did the Aga Khan University and Central Asian University and so on. And this was a way to create a space that in which our major institutions cannot so let me rephrase that. There's certain risks that are involved in certain activities. So certainly our council structure cannot get involved politically, but individual Ismailis can, and individual Ismailis can group together to form certain civil society organizations which pursue certain ends in terms of the membership and what the membership of that particular group agrees on. So I see this as another layer, another tier of civil society. It is autonomous of the Ismaili institutional structure. It is what happens in democracies, because we are all individuals. We can group together in partnership to carry out certain functions and certain interests. And so we have, I don't want to name any particular organizations, but we know that there are certain organizations in the United States, in other parts of the world that are basically formed by Ismailis. This is not an anti-institutional position. It is just an alternative position. The various websites that we have, they are providing another voice, which is enhancing our understanding of our faith. It is enabling certain commentary on cultural issues, on social issues, and so on. So I see this as a part of civil society, which is distinct from the layer which is occupied by our councils, ITREBs, AKDN, etc. So that's my thought on that.
That's very, very helpful. I think one of the things I hear you saying is that we are expansive in what there is room for, that it's an alternative way to operate and advocate. It doesn't have to be this kind of binary of either or, and that power and empowerment can be more widely distributed than the framework that we might have assumed coming in. And to me, that also talks a little bit about the evolution of our community in this country, in the West, that maybe what it looked like before, we are growing, we are evolving, and so there are more spaces. And I certainly see that with the generation that's younger than me. I remember there were some platforms that seemed very new when I was in college and now are becoming more mainstream. We have a question from the audience that I want to tie back into this. And it's the idea of like in a pluralistic framework for our community, this is the words of the person who asked the question, how does one distinguish between respect and embrace of individual viewpoints from acceptance of individualism and individualistic attitudes ahead of the broader interest of our community? For example, voting for my wallet versus support for a broader safety net for marginalized communities. And I think here there's also the layer of what does it mean to represent a community? So Jena, I'd love for you to start and then Professor Karim to follow on.
Great. Thank you, Shereen, and thank you for who asked this question, because I think it's a very important question, and I think it forms sort of it's the basis for the fractures that we spoke about at the beginning of this conversation, which is kind of how do we reconcile individually when we see someone doing something that is so opposed to our way of doing something, without maybe fully understanding why. So there's two elements to this. I mean, you know, to all of us, we are entrenched in our views, and we believe that those views are accurate all the time. And you know, certainly, I think at this moment in history, I think most people have very strong views. I think one thing to do is, you know, there are, of course, objectively bad things, right? There are objectively unacceptable things like racism, violence. Those are objective ethics that are unacceptable. But there are other things in the middle that are much more gray. And that's what I think how you distinguish between that is really to understand, to start with empathy. If you come at it with empathy. So there's a saying in Pakistan and it's about Karachi, and one of the taglines for Karachi is "Dekh magar pyar se." So look at Karachi, but look at it with love. Otherwise, you're going to see all the problems. You're going to see all the schisms. And we say that about Kabul too, right? If you look at Kabul objectively, you're going to see it very differently than if you adopt an empathetic stance automatically, because then it'll allow you to distinguish what is objectively bad, like racism, violence, you know, sowing very problematic seeds, to what is not problematic and what is maybe someone's lived experience, right? Why, for example, someone needs a tax cut, so they vote a certain way, and that tax cut actually benefits other families that they can employ as a result of having a tax cut, right? So it's sort of not a linear, easy question. And again, knowing that we all have very strong opinions about how we should be governed, approaching it with empathy, with a knowledge that there are objective things that are not acceptable. And the Imam, you know, this is the kind of great thing about being Ismaili, not to be super parochial, but this is the environment to be that way. We have a guide, we have parameters that are set that help us to kind of understand. But if it passes through an empathy lens and not a judgment lens, then we can have a better shot at understanding one another. And again, that doesn't mean that there's an expectation that you will change your mind or that person will change their mind, but it does allow us to function together, right? And in a sense of evaluate what is best for the community in different ways.
Yes, so I'll continue with. I think this is a question which has so much packed into it. It's a great question, and first of all, let's talk about representing a community. I think that becomes problematic because an individual, Ismaili, when she is or he is standing for office, running for office, cannot claim to represent the Ismaili community. She's representing a certain constituency, a certain body of electors in a particular geographical community. It may include Ismailis, it may include a whole number of other people. And so I think it becomes problematic when we see this aspect of public politics in relation to the community. So that's the first point I wanted to make. Secondly, building on what Jena said, yes, the question referred to respect, and what Jena referred to empathy, and these values go together. That is so important in the context of pluralism and political pluralism that we're speaking about specifically here. As individuals, as citizens of a political community, which is the United States, and of course broken down into states and counties and so on, there is an acceptance that people have different positions. And with that is the notion that we respect each other's differences, that this is how the political system is structured. So we are on different sides. We perhaps may never agree with each other, but respecting each other and perhaps even having empathy for each other, understanding this is the reason why this person, my neighbor, is voting in this particular way, which I will never do. And yet accepting that this person has the absolute right to be able to do this. And so the person sitting next to me in Jamaat Khana may be politically very different from me, but, well, once COVID is over, I guess we can do Shajudidar. But this is something that is very important, that we recognize the importance of having differences among each other. But also, as pointed out, then what holds this all together? What makes a country? What makes a community? So a country has certain basic values. And in the United States, the Constitution is a very important aspect of this. And allegiance is given to the Constitution, so that it's something, a document to which all citizens supposedly all abide by. And the political systems that go by in terms of how to vote, how to participate, these are all accepted by people who participate in them. Among Ismailis and as Muslims, we've spoken about certain values that have been with us since the beginning of Islam, since the time of the Prophet. And key among this is the sense of justice. When you look at how Prophet Muhammad acted with respect to the underprivileged, who were so important and so constantly occupied his mind, the widows who had been rejected by society, the orphans, the poor, the slaves. He spent a lot of time thinking about them as to how they could be uplifted in Medinan society, in Arabia, in the Hijaz. And so even with respect to other communities, like the Jews, so when he went to Medina after the Hijrah, the Ahad of Medina, which is sometimes called a constitution, but is not exactly a constitution, respected the tribes, the Jewish tribes who were part of Medina. And so you have the beginning of the idea of other kinds of pluralism as well from that early time. So these are the values that, and I'm not giving the whole list of the values, but these are the kinds of values which are key to us as a community, as a Muslim Ismaili community. And thankfully, Western societies, by and large, have a consonance of these values. There are certain things that we may disagree on with respect to details, but American society agrees on the importance of justice, on the importance of social justice, on the importance of equity. And I'm glad that Jena pointed out the difference between equality and equity, in that people are given their fair share, are given an opportunity to rise in society. And so this goes beyond a particular political system. So as I mentioned earlier, for the longest time until the mid-20th century, most Muslim states were monarchies of different kinds, run by sultans and caliphs and amirs and so on. And even our Fatimid Empire was run by the Imam Khalif and so on. So there is a certain understanding, but the values are the same in a way. importance of justice, the importance of equity, the importance of taking care of everyone in the society. And these continue in democratic societies. That's why we generally feel so comfortable living in Western societies. This is why we continue immigrating to these countries.
Jena, I think you had, yeah, go on.
Thank you. Yes, no, I think that was absolutely the case. And it's sort of interesting to take from our history and really apply it to contemporary circumstances so meaningfully and specifically. One thing I did want to point out on pluralism is that, you know, empathy is critical, number one, step one, without question. Number two is when we think about equity, as Professor Karim was saying, equity hinges on, you know, not even just a level playing field, but it kind of goes beyond that to uplift even, to compensate for past oppression. But one really significant way to start the process of rectifying that is education. And that's a critical thing, because not everyone who votes, not everyone has the same level of education, not everyone has the same access to education, not all of, you know, I can say personally, I grew up in extreme privilege. And I think some compensation for that, whether it's through civic education, through access to civic education, to help determine positioning and to help determine how you want to be represented, I think is really a big part of equity, which also feeds into pluralism, because our decision making is, everyone's decision making is different, but having at least a similar base of facts, and then, you know, however, whatever personal ethics or religion or theology to integrate is a very personal decision. But certainly tying to equity is education. And that may also present an opportunity in terms of unifying, right? Unifying through neutral, non-position-based education.
Yeah, and continuing education. I think one of the things that became very clear in 2016 to me personally was how much privilege I had. I think I personally thought about the fact that I'm Muslim and I personally have privilege, but I thought about the broader community of people who are Muslim and might have had to face Islamophobia. And it took a lot of self-reflection to come out of it and say, who am I not seeing when I am just looking at myself and my community of Muslim brothers and sisters who have so much bias that are against them structurally and whatever. And I think that is a lot of what we see in the younger generations of our Jamaat, which is they're seeing in a different way than maybe previous generations because of the way immigration patterns happen and survival happens when we move to Western countries. And so I make this point because it's not just formal education, right? It's exposing yourself to things that you may not have exposed yourself for whatever reason, and just learning about how people that are very different than us might approach the issues in their life. So I appreciate that. I think both Professor Karim and Jena, we've been talking a lot about respecting differences, and we're going into a really exciting part of the conversation, which is what can we do as individuals to continue to strengthen the processes of representation and democracy in our countries. And so I would love kind of going on the tactical, both within how we engage. We talked a lot about empathy in our Jamaat, but like, what else can we do in our Jamaat? What else can we do in our broader communities, in our cities, and where we live?
Should I go ahead? Okay. I think the American nation is at a very critical point right now. And the Jamaat, small as it is, has a very interesting and strategic role to play. The country needs healing because it's the discourse, the political discourse has been very fractious, especially during the election and before. And to a certain extent, the the fractures seem to have penetrated into the Jamaat. So there is, of course, the healing within the Jamaat, which is very important. And we've been talking about respecting each other in terms of having the right to have our own political positions. But then there is an interesting task that the Jamaat may have. What role can we have, can American Ismailis have with respect to healing the larger society in our neighborhoods, in the institutions where we operate, in our workplaces, in our circles of friends, in our schools, where our children may be going to school or we ourselves going to school? What can we do? Because I think the country is yearning for a healing process. Everyone may not admit to it, but everyone does need it. People on both sides. And this involves, beyond empathy, or perhaps as part of empathy, not shaming people or trying to shame people for holding certain positions, not criticizing people, but living with your neighbors and figuring out how do we go ahead. And this obviously, first of all, has to be worked out within the community and then outside. And it's an individual task as well as a communal task. It is so important at this point. And I think the community has a chance to really play an important role, being what it is, being the dynamic group that we are, the dynamic Jamaat that we are, the kind of volunteerism which we are so proud of. Here we have an opportunity to take it beyond, because this is the need of the moment. This is something that is desperately needed, because the last thing that the country needs is more division. It would hurt everyone. And speaking as a Canadian, it will hurt me too in my country, because we are neighbors. We are so reliant on each other. And so it is in the benefit, it is for the benefit of everyone that a healing process be figured out. People start discussing how to go about doing that. But first of all, obviously, we need to look within the Jamaat, show that kind of empathy, that respect, healing, and then move outwards.
Jena, I am going to insert a couple questions before you respond, if that's okay. In your response, some of this is coming from audience members. Can you talk a little bit about dismantling current structures of power and perhaps what redistribution of power might look like? And also how, as migrant groups, we might have benefited from the civil rights movement led by African Americans and other communities of color? And do we understand that we benefit from their legacies? No pressure.
Is that for me or for Professor Karim?
That's for you. Those are from a couple questions that came in from the audience.
That was actually one thing that I really wanted to bring up, is when I saw ITREB work with African American Muslims, I was so over the moon, because that is something that we have not focused on as much kind of in large scales. And so that is such an opportunity for us to start the process of acknowledging that and having conversations around what the African American communities have done for us in terms of opening the space and keeping that space open, and fighting those battles so that we could absolutely benefit. And so I think there is an increased, much more so than before, right? Where, we did separate ourselves, the South Asian immigrants, we lived in installation because that was what needed to happen. People didn't know the language. It was a very overwhelming experience to be an immigrant. And so you tend to stick to what is familiar. But now, after we've been here for a few generations, we've integrated into society while retaining our own culture, we have the ability now to actually acknowledge, engage, and promote and lift up and do our part now and contribute to the upliftment of those who have lifted us. And I think there's an increased sort of sensibility about the connection between that. But I think, again, to me, it comes back to educating people on how civil rights legislation has benefited us. Just like when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed, I frankly didn't know all that she, all that she had done for women. I knew the more recent things in my lifetime, but certainly what she did for us before. I mean, those are things that you have to learn and you have to seek knowledge on it, and that's sometimes a little bit difficult, especially with communities we may be less familiar with, or frankly, and speaking very candidly, less comfortable with. Because of existing biases. So it means going kind of through our own biases, understanding what our biases are, and understanding how those biases can be not protective, but can be very problematic. And that's kind of, to me, the first step of dealing with privilege, is the bias issue. But I mean, again, huge strides are being made, much more to be done.
Dr. Karim, I don't know if you wanted to jump in again, otherwise I can
Actually,
keep pushing the conversation.
I noticed that there's a certain, there's a question, well, actually it's a comment by a certain member of the audience, and I found it quite striking. It's very good. I'm really happy. And he or she points out Ismaili values and includes a whole range of values: honesty, integrity, brotherhood. I would say fellowship, perhaps, is a non-gender, perhaps. I don't know, even if fellowship is biased more towards males. Kindness, humility, etc. I mean, these, who can argue with this? And whether we are part of the Abrahamic faiths or the Hindu or the Buddhist faiths, or whichever, we all agree on this. So what are our commonalities? Let's try and unite over that, certainly within the community and outside. But then he or she goes on to say, seek knowledge continuously, seek knowledge and also continuous search for truth. This is so important in our times. And let me dwell a little bit in terms of how this relates to our faith. Now, you may or may not know that the word Ismaili was actually given to us earlier on in our history, after Imam Jafar as-Sadiq's passing and Imam Ismail becoming the Imam, our Imam, by heresiographers who were not Ismaili. And it was a name that was actually not used by Ismailis consistently until the early 20th century, until the Aga Khan case, when the judge for the Aga Khan case defined us as Shia Imami Ismailis. So this is not a name necessarily that we have given to ourselves. Then how are we known? Well, some of you may know that the actual name that before the Fatimid period, during the Fatimid period, and after the Fatimid period, the preferred name was Dawat al-Haq, invitation to truth. And this is a very, very important value for us. So even when the peers came from Iran to India, the name that they gave to this faith in Indian terms was Satpanth, the path of truth, the true path. We have not really explored that particular aspect of our faith. It is so key to us. I'm so glad that the person with the question raised that, because it is innate. It's part of our Ginans. It's, of course, it's part of the Quran. It's part of Nasir Khusro's writings and so on. In that, this is the ultimate in terms of what we are interested in. Of course, you could say every religion talks about truth, but we have specifically identified ourselves for over 1,000 years with respect to the constant search for truth. And what does that mean? We need to spend a lot of time thinking about that. What does it mean to be seekers of truth in our social lives, in our religious lives, in our political lives? Because it comes to those values, those ethics that we have been talking about, because in them is embedded the search for truth. And as I've been saying, this is not dissimilar to what other people are striving for, but we have ascribed to ourselves a particular mission, and it is consonant in terms of our religious values and our other values and how we live in the larger society. So it is also consonant with the values of other people. And in a country, in a society, well, in a world where truth has become devalued, we call about ourselves as living in the post-truth era. Well, unfortunately, as a person who studies this for a living, truth has been under attack, as we know, for many, many generations, for hundreds of years. And it's a constant struggle that people of faith have had with respect to adhering to the truth. And what does that mean really to us with respect to our engagement in is with respect to the notion of a just and an honest engagement with our society. Now, there was a question which popped up with respect to whether I'm talking about cosmopolitan ethics. This is part of it. Of course, ethics as a whole is part of this. And the way that Maulana Hazrat Imam has talked about cosmopolitan ethics is in the context of pluralism, that this is something that we look outwards at the entire world, that we are cosmopolitan, not only looking at ourselves, that we are looking at the differences around the world in other peoples and how do we engage with them? How do we understand our identity and our preferences in relation to other people's preferences? And understanding that if people are abiding by basic values for justice and truth and honesty and integrity and so on, they may have a different interpretation of things and a different political position, but they're not necessarily against us where it counts. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to merge a couple of different questions together from the audience. Someone said, most people think that the type of democracy that should be adopted is the US democratic style. However, I think Hazrat Imam has referred to other types of democratic processes. Are you able to shed light on this? And if you could answer that also with the context of another question that came in, which says, does our community encourage political activism? And someone else kind of followed up and said, we as a community have chosen to remain largely apolitical, perhaps as a function of our migrant experience and the need to protect ourselves and fly under the radar. Are we in a new stage now to change this approach and get more active as a community? So broadly, what are other democratic processes as inspired by Maulana Hazrat Imam? And given that, how do we also be a little bit more active? Can we, should we? Where are we going with this? Jena, if you want to start.
Sure. This U.S. model of democracy question it's absolutely such a critical question for us because it's something that as democracy practitioners, we get asked all the time. And my stock answer to civil society groups here is that by and large, we're probably giving standards that are lessons learned from our own countries, as opposed to imposing a US model of democracy. Because, oh my goodness, if you had to do this type of democracy in a developing country where there is immediate and violent ethnic conflict, it would be deeply, deeply problematic. And so we joke kind of in our sort of, in our industry that we're probably giving you lessons learned. And the idea is for civil society or political parties or other groupings within the society to identify what it is they want and how they want to be governed. So it's not an imposition of any one model of democracy, because there are benefits and risks to all of them. So, and this is probably, we don't have a state currently, and in contemporary times, we have not had a state. So there is space for pluralism in US democracy, which is a majoritarian system. There is a space for democracy in parliamentary or proportional systems. There's a space for pluralism in those types of governing models. It really is dependent on the country's history. That is sort of what determines a political system. And there is space for pluralism, you know, autocracy notwithstanding, however, there is less space for pluralism, perhaps the most need for pluralism in an autocratic government. But in the various configurations of democracy, there is space for ethics and there's space for pluralism. And very often that is the basis of that democracy. But again, to look at the individual country experiences. So for example, the US and Canada have a very different sort of history, and you can see that so the US has a very adversarial legal culture. It's very sort of one side versus another. In Canada, it's a lot more collaborative. There are historical reasons for that, right? It's how rule of law developed, and it's how slowly it developed, and their colonial history. So without getting into all of that, the history matters. Again, going back to lived experiences, countries also have lived experiences. So that's something to be sort of mindful of, but there is space for pluralism in all of the above, and there's space for cosmopolitan ethics in all of the above. In terms of political activism and being apolitical, one way to start, so the United States, it's earlier in like the 1920s, it was known as the nation of joiners. Lots of associations, women's associations, so many different types of associations to kind of get groups together to develop sorts of ways of developing power. And it's even more true now. I mean, look at the technology we have to interact with each other. Had this pandemic happened 20 years ago, we would be in a very different situation. So there are opportunities to engage. Now, whether, going back to the question of who represents the Ismaili community, we have that structure that has been put forth by the imam. And that structure is what that structure is. But that doesn't mean that as individuals, people can't participate in different ways, whether it's civic engagement at a community level or it's a deeper sort of a running for office. There are many ways to go about it, but how you're representing yourself. But then when you think about it, Hazri Imam also talks about an ambassadorial role. So whether, whereas maybe officially the community does not take a political position because we are pluralist and we have different positions within our community, certainly we have options to be ambassadors of our tradition, of our ethics, and of our own lived experiences, as Hazri Imam points out. So there's a lot of options. It's not, I'm sorry, it's not a black and white answer. I know that can be very frustrating, but there is a line, right? And I think that there are opportunities like ITREB engaging in community sort of development, right? It's something that we use in Sudan with people who didn't get along. They got together on community development. That was a way to bring people together. It was apolitical, it had to be. But again, Islam does promote the social role, and it's up to you as individuals to then determine what that role is going to be.
Thank you. Professor Karim, I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball at you. Jena's perspective was very helpful in understanding the individual Ismaili as being politically active. In your response, if you could talk also about whether there's a role as the community to be more politically active, to the point that the person made about being a little bit under the radar up until this point. Is there now a potential change in the way that we understand this?
It's an important question. First of all, I'd like to reframe the word activism in favor of participation, which is also a word that we've been using before. Think of participation. And so, in terms of the associations, politics is not only in terms of, the House of Representatives or Congress or Senate or the presidency, whatever, at whatever level, but it is these associations and how we learn to work together, whether it is the Parent-Teacher Association or other kinds of groups or even unions, etc., or business associations. This process helps us work with other people who may have different ideas, who may not necessarily like, but we figure out what is the art of compromise, negotiation. It's a diplomatic process. It's perhaps what Hazri Imam talks about with respect to the cosmopolitan ethic, that we are engaging with others and we are learning the tactics and the techniques of negotiation, of how to move forward on a common front even when people have different ideas as to how to get there. So this is important overall. So with respect to the community, as in terms of being participatory in that way. So with iServe, we have that particular approach in which you have masses of Ismaili volunteers helping out after floods, after hurricanes, and so on, doing some wonderful work, working with cities, etc. And this is very, very commendable. And this is the kind of participation that I'm talking about. What I worry about, if the council, for example, was to take a position with respect to uh, capital P, uppercase P politics, that can be very, very damaging, because you're dragging the entire name of the community, and you have to identify with a political party or a political position, and it creates a lot of discomfort within the Jamaat, and it sort of boxes the entire community under one particular rubric, and that can be dangerous and very risky. So I certainly would not see that as a very healthy position. And just going back to political participation at the individual level, think about what you are really interested in doing. How do you want to make the world a better place? How do you want to make your neighborhood and your country a better place? Don't just participate for the sake of participation. Or as someone whom I had a conversation about 10 years ago said, this person is a rebel looking for a cause. It's don't just sort of glorify it and romanticize, this thing that you have to do it in this particular way. Put the cause first. What do you really care about? What is the difference you want to make? How do you want to make the world a better place? How do you want to make your society a better place? One that is harmonious, in which people get along with each other, figure out ways of engaging in a common cause and moving forward. And as I said before, the big cause right now is how do Americans heal? How does the Jamaat heal? That in itself is a huge cause.
Yeah. Some of what you were talking about reminded me of my days at the State Department, where I worked on Muslim engagement, and a lot of people looked at me as someone who could represent Ismaili Muslims. And it's very difficult. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of that, what we're talking about, is very murky space. And it's a call for the fact that there are uncomfortable spaces, and they're probably not going to go away. And a lot of it is like, how do we navigate these spaces of uncertainty where words fail us, frameworks fail us, the way the media wants to simplify how democracy works in the US fails us. And I want to take this to the idea of language. We have a question from someone in the audience who says, as a community who has been strongly vocal about pluralism, should we not use the term like people of color or some other superficial term? We should focus on the issues that are creating the division. Being in a bandwagon won't resolve the issue. And so I would love you both to address that question directly, and also comment on the context of language and where the limits of language, there might be a limit of language both at the national level in the US, but also in terms of our community. And I see that too. There are terms that I use with the older generation of my family that are just new terms. And sometimes the terms are what leads to an opening. So if you could help us consider what might be the role of language and where it's going even within our community, which has very insider language. Professor Karim, please go ahead.
Okay. So we do live as human beings. We basically communicate through language. I mean, that's a given. But language can be very, very tricky, because it sometimes boxes us into uses of certain kinds of terminology, certain words, which are interpreted differently, which can gain a certain kind of baggage and can be misinterpreted and can have hold different meanings for different people and different contexts. So let's talk about the term person of color. Racism, of course, racial issues are very, very critical. We have to recognize them. We have to fight racism. That's a given. Now, to me, I have written quite extensively on these issues of terminology within multiculturalism, racial issues, and so on. The word person of color is really taken off, but what it does for me, and this is a personal point of view, is that it essentializes one aspect of a human being, her skin color. She is much, much more than that. Yes, she has a racial identity. She has a particular color of epidermis, but she has a particular gender, a professional identity, a religious identity. And to judge people, that's the technique of racism. Basically, you're playing into the very trope of skin color, of the very stimulus of skin color to identify who you are. In Canada, the government has a term called visible minorities. I wrote a 50-page paper when I was in the government, telling the government why this is wrong. Unfortunately, my paper was shelved, but that's besides the point. So the terminology continues to be a problem. The term that I prefer, which people may or may not like, is racialized communities or racialized person, because that is the problem. You are racializing and making that person less than what he or she is. But there's a bigger issue of terminology and what the media tend to do with the issue of politics in general. So we've heard commentary ad nauseum about people on the left, people on the right, progressives, people who are conservative. But then there are interesting things that have been happening, even in the American context. So we've got the Lincoln Project, in which Republicans supported the Democratic candidate. Previously, we had what were called the Reagan Democrats, who voted for Ronald Reagan. So to box ourselves, even along party lines, as if even with card-carrying members, registered members of particular parties, this doesn't mean that they are boxed in. There is fluidity, which we need to recognize. So by calling a person a progressive, so for example, one of the, Jena, you have suggested that reading Progressive Muslims is a very, very good book. But it was interesting to note what happened to that particular movement among Muslims who identified themselves as progressives when one person and this was in the 1990s, sorry, the 2000s, when a prominent member of that group said we have to have someone from the Bush government, the George W. Bush government, participate in discussions with us, other people felt very offended. And so the whole enterprise fell apart. So when you present a particular notion of what are progressives, when you have to have just these positions and you set things in stone, you don't allow for fluidity, it breaks down. So pluralism has to account for fluidity, for change, for being flexible, being able to listen to various positions, and so on. And when we use terms like the Muslim vote, or even terms like the Ismaili community in a political context, what does the word community mean there? Because we have been discussing for the past hour how pluralistic we are with respect to political positions. So we need to understand these words with nuance, that they are complex terms. We need to, the biggest problem we have is because the information we obtain is largely from the media. And I work in a school of journalism and communication, and I'm constantly fighting these tendencies among students and even my colleagues to create these categories which become sacrosanct. We have to leave these categories open, allow for flexibility, and use our own critical judgment constantly in the way that we are spoken to, in the way we speak, because the media constantly want to draw us into these boxes of left and right, and that this is the way they are, they will never change, there's no crossover. Crossover takes place more often than we realize.
Jena?
Sure. No, I think that's absolutely true, that there is, the challenge of pluralism is often this fluidity. And just a point that I wanted to underscore in terms of how people identify, um, we're all going to make mistakes. We all probably have, in terms of how we approach someone or how we address someone. And so it's really important, I think, to meet people where they are, because some people find comfort in being categorized or identifying a certain way because it gives them a sense of community. Other people don't want to be essentialized, or they want it in some ways and not in others. So I think to reduce the complexity, it's just important to be people, and ask questions. And it's uncomfortable. And as long as it's done with respect, and this might be a slightly less incendiary example, but people ask me all the time how to pronounce my name, and I certainly appreciate that. Instead of just trying to venture a guess and hoping for the best, sometimes you have to read. That's a part of the outreach, and that's a part of the slightly uncomfortable part of pluralism, which is meeting people where they are and how they want to be identified, as opposed to creating titles and categories that, as Professor Karim rightly pointed out, essentialize them. And also being conscious of the fact that some of those titles give people community, and that might be what they value. And so talking to people, and it comes down to another thing other than people to people contact, which is educating ourselves on these debates, so that we can be absolutely aware of what is appropriate and what is inappropriate and why it's inappropriate. And it's not necessarily our fault. We can't keep track of all of the information, but seeking information, seeking knowledge through relationships, through actual doing the hard work, and not relying on other people to determine our views, but to actually, and not burdening them with educating us, but actually educating ourselves, I think is a really critical thing. And in terms of the progressive Islam, absolutely, there were schisms then, but I think that there is an understanding amongst a lot of progressive movements, not all, but a lot, whether it's political progressives in the United States, in Canada, wherever, that there is the need for some outreach across lines. Maybe necessity is the mother of all invention, or innovation. Maybe that's where we're at, and this is the opportunity we have to go forward, which is that now we're in a position to actually need to interact with each other, because the slim margins tell us that we're always going to be on the cusp of this polarization is going to be here for a while. So hopefully there is space and there is scope for those interactions to happen.
Thank you both so much. We have reached the end of our conversation. I want to thank both of you for helping us create the space and the language and the concepts to think about these issues critically. And I want to especially thank the audience for your engagement and for really showing up as what is so clear to me as people who are participating already, who are thinking about how can we do this in a way that is consistent with our ethics and our faith. And in that, I especially want to thank ITREB USA. None of the three of us are representing ITREB. We've been invited to be here. And I am so, so grateful and honestly proud that these spaces are opening up in this moment. And just like our tradition and our history. We are constantly evolving as a community, and I think that is one of our greatest gifts, to actually be able to pursue with knowledge and collaboration and camaraderie. So thank you to Farhana and the whole team. We are going to drop some resources that were shared by Professor Karim and Jena into the chat. So please do check them out. And thank you again, everyone, for being here.